They were adjusting the microphone when someone tapped my elbow and said, "Ma'am, you can't stand there." I stepped back because the rope was already moving, and I didn't want to make a scene. My husband's oldest daughter cleared her throat and smiled at the cameras like she'd practiced. Someone behind me whispered, "Is that her?" And I didn't turn around. I'm Denise Walker. I'm 40 years old. I grew up on the south side of Columbus, Ohio, raised by a mother who taught Sunday school and worked nights at Mount Carmel. I learned early how to keep my voice level, how to watch rooms before I spoke, how to let people underestimate me without correcting them. That morning, standing on the marble steps outside the courthouse, I needed all of that training just to stay upright. They had called it a family statement. That's what the email said. Neutral font, neutral subject line. I wore a black coat I'd had since my first year married, the one with the loose button at the wrist. I didn't expect cameras. I didn't expect the rented podium with the county seal taped over. I didn't expect the rope. When my husband, Robert, died 2 weeks earlier, I hadn't thought much about his children beyond logistics. Who needed to be called? Who would want to view the body? Which church announcements to cancel and which to keep? Grief does that to you. It narrows your field of vision. You see what's in front of you and not much else. Robert had been a billionaire on paper, at least according to the magazines that like to rank people. To me, he was a man who drank his coffee lukewarm and forgot to replace the toilet paper roll. We were married 17 years. I was younger than him, but not young. When we met, I was already settled in myself. I didn't need saving, and I didn't need his money. That was something his children never quite believed. The microphone squealed. A reporter asked for quiet. I stood behind the rope with my hands folded because I didn't know what else to do with them. His daughter said my name wrong. She always had. As we move forward, she said, "The family wants to be clear that Denise Walker is no longer considered part of our family." Effective immediately. Someone inhaled sharply to my left. I felt it more than I heard it. They used the phrase "removed from the family forever." That part got repeated later, clipped and replayed. At the time, it just sounded strange, like language borrowed from somewhere else. Families don't usually remove people with press conferences. They argue quietly. They stop answering calls. They let things die on their own. But Robert's children were always precise. He'd taught them that. Precision looks a lot like control if you don't know the difference. I remember thinking absurdly about my shoes. They were sensible, low heel, scuffed at the toe. I'd worn them to the hospital the night Robert died, when the nurse, young, kind, careful, handed me his wedding ring in a plastic cup. Authority figures have a way of making moments feel official. Like once they speak, the thing is true. The daughter continued. There was talk of legacy, of protecting their father's wishes, of clarity. She didn't look at me, not once. Her brother stood behind her, hands clasped, nodding at the right places. The youngest, my stepson, though I could feel that word slipping, watched the crowd like he was counting exits. A man from the church I attend stepped closer. "You okay?" He murmured. I nodded because that's what you do when you don't want to answer. Before we go any further, I want to pause for a moment. Please write in the comments where you're watching this from. And don't forget to like and subscribe so this channel can keep growing and bring you even more fascinating stories. After they finished, there was polite applause. Not much. Enough. Reporters shouted questions, but not at me. No one asked how long we'd been married. No one asked who had sat by Robert's bed the last 6 months when his hands shook too badly to sign checks. No one asked who'd learned to read his breathing in the dark. A clerk from the courthouse, someone I recognized from other days, other paperwork, caught my eye. She gave me a look that wasn't pity exactly, more like recognition, as if she'd seen this kind of thing before and knew better than to comment. I left before the questions turned sharper. In my car, I sat with my hands on the wheel until the shaking passed. The radio was still on from the drive over. A gospel song came through, low and steady. I turned it off. At home, there were envelopes waiting. Certified mail. Heavy paper. My name typed cleanly. Inside were notices about access. about temporary restrictions, about upcoming readings and filings. Language so careful it almost sounded kind. I called Robert's sister. We'd always been cordial. She answered on the third ring and said, I can't talk right now. Not angry, just finished. Like a door closed gently but firmly. I thought about the first Thanksgiving we hosted after the wedding. How his mother had rearranged my table settings without asking. How Robert had watched and said nothing. At the time, I told myself it was easier not to correct every small thing. That marriage was about choosing your battles. That afternoon, a neighbor knocked with a casserole. She didn't mention the press conference. She said, eat something. Authority doesn't always wear a badge. Sometimes it comes in a foil pan and a quiet voice. I didn't cry until later, alone, folding Robert's shirts because I didn't know what else to do with my hands. Even then, it wasn't about the cameras or the words. It was about the certainty in their faces. The way they celebrated early, like the outcome had been decided long before anyone died. I went to bed that night with a sense that something had shifted, not all at once, but enough to notice. Like a floor that tilts just a little. You don't fall. You just learn to stand differently. The next morning, I woke before the alarm, the way you do when your body decides rest is no longer efficient. The house was quiet in that way that feels borrowed. Robert's side of the bed was already cooling into neutrality. I lay there listening for sounds that weren't coming, the shuffle of his slippers, the coffee tried to hide. And then I got up because lying still felt like agreeing with something I didn't understand yet. There was a voicemail from a woman who introduced herself as an estate coordinator. She spoke slowly, carefully, as if reading from a script she'd written herself. She said there would be a formal reading in a few weeks. It would be televised due to the size of the estate. She emphasized that word, size, as if it explained everything. She said my attendance was optional but recommended, not required, not assumed. I called her back and asked what optional meant in practice. There was a pause, just long enough to register. It means, she said, that you're not obligated. After that, the calls thinned. People who used to check in daily started spacing things out. My phone would light up with names I didn't recognize, assistants, legal aides, a woman from Robert's Foundation asking about keys and passwords. Each conversation ended with some version of, we'll be in touch, which I learned quickly meant they wouldn't be unless someone told them to. At church that Sunday, the pews felt closer together. Not hostile, just attentive. A few women hugged me longer than usual. One whispered, I saw it on the news. She didn't say what it was. She didn't need to. The sermon was about inheritance. Not money, spiritual inheritance, legacy, responsibility. I don't believe God plans sermons around my life, but I do believe timing has a sense of humor. When the pastor talked about what we leave behind, I thought about Robert's hands again, how they trembled when he signed hospital forms, how he joked about it to keep me from worrying. I thought about all the documents he'd signed before that, over years, steady and decisive. After service, his mother didn't approach me. She stood with her daughters, heads close together. When I walked past, she nodded, polite, finished. Back home, I started organizing paperwork because it was something I could control. File cabinets I hadn't touched in years. Old tax returns. Property records. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. I told myself I was just making things easier for whoever came next. That's when I found the envelope. It was tucked into a folder labeled Philanthropy Misc. Thick paper. My name handwritten on the front in Robert's blocky script. I opened it expecting a note, maybe instructions. Inside was a copy of a trust document, dated 17 years ago, the year we got married. I didn't read it all at once. I skimmed, the way you do when you're afraid of what you might see. There were sections I recognized, foundation language, beneficiary terms. But there were also references I didn't understand. Cross-references to amendments I'd never seen. Clauses that pointed elsewhere. I told myself it was nothing, that Robert had always compartmentalized. Business over here. family over there, me somewhere in between. I put the document back in the envelope and slid it into the folder. A near discovery, though I didn't have that word for it yet. Just a sense of something unresolved. That afternoon, the lawyer called. Not Robert's longtime attorney, the one who used to send us holiday cards, but someone newer, younger. He said there had been some confusion about access to accounts. He said it gently, like confusion was a shared misunderstanding and not a decision someone had already made. I asked him directly if I was still considered Robert's spouse in the eyes of the estate. He cleared his throat. Legally, yes, he said. Relationally, there are complexities. Complexities is a word people use when they don't want to say conflict. A few days later, I went to the bank where Robert and I had kept a joint account for household expenses. The teller recognized me. She always had. We talked about her kids, about college applications. She typed, frowned slightly, then typed again. "One moment," she said, and disappeared into the back. When she returned, her smile was thinner. "There's a temporary hold," she said. "Administrative." I asked who had requested it. She shook her head. "I'm not authorized to say." Authority again. Quiet, procedural, unemotional. I paid the utility bill with a credit card instead. It went through. For now. That night, Robert's youngest son called. He hadn't spoken to me since the press conference. He said he just wanted to check in. His voice sounded careful, like he was reading from memory instead of feeling. He asked if I was holding up. I told him I was managing. There was a pause. Then he said, "You know this isn't personal." That sentence landed harder than anything else that week. Because if it wasn't personal, then it was structural, systemic, something bigger than feelings. Before we hung up, he mentioned the will reading. "It'll clear things up," he said. Dad was very specific. Specific. Another word for control. After the call, I pulled the envelope back out. This time, I read more slowly. I noticed how often Robert's name appeared alongside phrases like "at the discretion of" and "upon public disclosure." I noticed dates, drafts revised not long after arguments I remembered, holidays that had ended stiffly, silences that had stretched longer than usual. I thought about the time years ago when I'd asked Robert why he never talked through disagreements with his kids directly. He'd said, "Some things are better handled on paper." At the time, I thought he meant avoiding fights. Now, I wondered what else he'd meant. The unease didn't explode. It accumulated. In the way a house settles, slow and almost polite, until one day a door won't close the way it used to. I put the document back again. I wasn't ready to know what it meant. Not yet. I still believed there was a reasonable explanation. That the press conference had been about image, not outcome. That the will reading would confirm what I already knew. That 17 years counted for something. That belief got me through the days that followed. It let me answer emails calmly. It let me show up where I was still welcome and stay home where I wasn't. It let me misread the signs without feeling foolish. But the pattern was already there, waiting for me to catch up. The week before the will reading, I learned how many people can make decisions about your life without ever raising their voice. It started with the car. I went to the garage on a Tuesday morning, coffee still too hot to drink, and the space where Robert's sedan usually sat was empty. For a second, I thought I'd misremembered. Grief plays tricks like that. But the oil stain was still there. The faint smell of leather and cologne wasn't. I called the dealership. They transferred me twice before a man explained, apologetically, that the vehicle had been reassigned. Estate instructions. Temporary. Who authorized that? I asked. He hesitated. The family representative. I didn't correct him. I didn't ask which family he meant. Instead, I took the bus downtown. I hadn't ridden it in years, but the route was familiar enough. Two women in the front argued quietly about a utility bill. A man slept with his head against the window. No one recognized me there. That anonymity felt like a relief and an insult at the same time. At work, My supervisor asked if I wanted to take more time off. She phrased it like an offer, but her eyes asked a different question. How long would this situation make things awkward? I told her I was fine. That word again. Fine does a lot of work when you let it. During lunch, I checked my email and found a message from the foundation's HR department. It thanked me for my past support and informed me that my volunteer access had been paused pending review. I'd been helping with community outreach for years, organizing drives, sitting in meetings that ran too long. I'd never been paid. I'd never thought of it as leverage. I forwarded the email to the estate coordinator, the one who'd used the word optional. She replied hours later with a single sentence. These measures are standard during transitions. Standard is what people call things once they've decided you don't need an explanation. That evening, I went through old calendars, the paper kind Robert liked. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Maybe proof that my memory wasn't lying to me. I found notes in his handwriting. Decall. Revised trust. Meetel. Dates clustered around family events. After holidays. After hospitalizations. After moments I thought were resolved because we stopped talking about them. Another near discovery. The pattern was there, but I still didn't name it. On Thursday, a woman from the probate court called to confirm my address for official correspondence. She pronounced my name correctly. That small accuracy felt like a kindness. She explained the seating arrangement for the will reading. Who would be where? She said, "You'll be in the second row. Not beside the children. Not behind them either. Adjacent. Careful. Neutral. Is there anything I should prepare?" Asked. She paused. "Just be present," she said, "and listen." The night before the reading, Robert's sister finally came by. She didn't call first. She stood on the porch with her coat still on, hands folded like she might leave at any moment. "I shouldn't be here," she said. "You're here anyway," I replied. She didn't sit. She didn't take the tea I offered. She told me the children were convinced they were honoring their father, that the press conference had been necessary, that things had been decided long ago. "What things?" I asked. She looked at the floor. "You know how Robert was," she said. "Always planning." After she left, I stood in the kitchen staring at the sink until the light outside changed. Planning. Another word that sounded harmless until you stacked it next to everything else. The day of the will reading arrived gray and cold. The courthouse lobby buzzed with reporters and security. A clerk checked my name off a list and handed me a badge. Visitor. White background. Black letters. Inside, the room was arranged like a small theater. Cameras lined the back wall. The children sat together in the front row, backs straight, faces composed. Their mother, Robert's first wife, sat 2 seats away from them, separate but aligned. When she saw me, she nodded once. Not hostile, not warm. I took my seat in the second row. The chair felt too low. The lawyer entered without ceremony. Older than I expected. Gray hair, heavy glasses. He didn't look at the cameras. He looked at the documents in his hands, as if they carried their own gravity. He began with standard language. Assets. Holdings. Percentages. I listened without reacting. The way you do when you're bracing for impact, but don't know from which direction. There were moments when the children exchanged glances, small smiles. Quiet confirmations. I recognized that look. I'd seen it at the press conference. Then the lawyer paused. He adjusted his glasses and said, "Before we proceed, there is an addendum that must be read in full as stipulated." The room shifted. Not dramatically, just enough. He dated it aloud. 17 years prior. I felt my stomach tighten, though I still didn't understand why. He began to read. Language dense, careful. References to contingencies. To public actions. To conditions triggered not by death alone, but by behavior after it. I caught phrases. In the event of public disavowal. Upon televised declaration. Authority transfers. A ripple moved through the front row. Confusion, then irritation. The youngest son leaned forward. The oldest daughter stiffened. The lawyer continued, voice steady. I realized slowly that the document in my folder, the one I'd skimmed and set aside, was not an appendix. It was a map. But even then, I didn't fully grasp where it led. Not yet. The lawyer didn't stop when the room started to murmur. He waited for quiet the way someone who has spent years in courtrooms learns to, by doing nothing at all. Eventually, the whispers collapsed under their own weight. He read the clause again, slower this time, as if repetition might make it less sharp. It didn't. The addendum outlined a structure I'd never known existed. A conditional trust layered beneath the visible one. Activated not by Robert's death alone, but by specific actions taken after it. Actions that suggested, in his words, a material effort to publicly sever or discredit the lawful spouse. The children's attorney stood up. Objection, he said, though there was nothing to object to yet. The lawyer looked at him calmly. This is not a proceeding, he replied. This is a reading. I sat still, hands folded in my lap, trying not to react because reacting felt like stepping into a story that wasn't finished telling itself. The clause didn't say what I would receive. Not yet. It said what would happen if certain lines were crossed. If the estate's representatives attempted to erase the spouse's status through public declaration. If family members sought to establish legitimacy by spectacle rather than process. Spectacle. That word landed like a quiet accusation. The lawyer referenced dates, media filings, public records, a press conference held on courthouse steps. The cameras shifted. Someone coughed. Robert's oldest daughter whispered something to her brother. He shook his head, barely perceptible. Still, none of this felt like a victory. It felt procedural, almost boring, the way consequences usually do when they arrive on time. The lawyer moved on to the main body of the will. This part was more familiar. Assets divided among trusts, foundations, long-term holdings managed by boards I recognized. The children relaxed again, incrementally. This was the explanation they'd been waiting for. The one that made sense of the last few weeks. I felt it too. Relief, thin but present. The false resolution settling in. The belief that the addendum was a warning, not a mechanism. That Robert had intended to scold, not to upend. Then the lawyer turned a page. There's a subsequent directive, he said. That applies only if the conditions of the addendum are met. Silence returned, heavier this time. He explained that the conditional trust, once activated, reassigned authority over certain decisions. Not ownership. Authority. Control over access, timing, and public narrative. Those powers would transfer away from the family representatives and into the hands of an independent executor. He named her. A woman I'd met once, briefly, years ago, at a charity dinner. A retired judge. Someone Robert respected precisely because she didn't owe him anything. The children's attorney stood again. This is highly irregular. The lawyer nodded. So is a press conference. A few people left. Nervously. The judge, now executor, sat near the aisle. She didn't smile. She didn't look at me. She wrote something on a legal pad. The lawyer continued, explaining that certain restrictions placed on me, account holds, access limitations, role suspensions, were to be reviewed immediately. If found to be enacted as part of the public disavowal, they would be reversed. I felt heat rise in my face, not triumph, but exposure. Every quiet humiliation of the last 2 weeks was being named without emotion, cataloged, made legible. Still, the will did not yet say what I would receive beyond what I already knew. The house remained in trust. The joint accounts were addressed. The foundations stayed intact. This was the part that confused me later, when people asked why I hadn't celebrated, why I hadn't smiled when the cameras turned my way. There was nothing to celebrate yet, only a shifting of weight. The lawyer concluded the reading with instructions for next steps, meetings, reviews, timelines. He closed the folder and thanked everyone for their attention. The room erupted into movement. Lawyers converged. Reporters leaned forward. The children stood quickly, faces tight. Their mother whispered urgently to the attorney. I stayed seated. The retired judge approached me last. She introduced herself again, as if the past meeting hadn't mattered. We'll talk soon, she said. Her voice was neutral, professional. Not kind, not cruel. Afterward, outside the courthouse, the cameras were waiting again. Reporters shouted questions. Do you feel vindicated? Was this revenge? Did you know? I didn't answer. I walked past them and kept walking until the noise softened. At home, the phone rang nonstop. Some calls I took, some I didn't. The estate coordinator left a message apologizing for any confusion. The bank called to inform me the hold was being lifted. The foundation's HR department emailed to say my access was restored effective immediately. That night, I slept for the first time since Robert died without waking every hour. In the morning, the unease returned, but altered, sharper, more specific, because the will reading hadn't resolved anything. It had only removed the cover. I still believed, wrongly, that the worst was over, that Robert had planned for fairness, not fracture, that the children would recalibrate now that the lines were clear. I didn't yet understand that the real consequences wouldn't come from the document itself, but from how everyone chose to respond to it. In the days after the will reading, everything looked like it was settling. That's the word people kept using, settling, as if the ground hadn't shifted, only the dust. The bank unfroze the accounts with a short apology and no explanation. A courier delivered the car back to the garage without knocking. The foundation reinstated my volunteer role and added a line about ongoing appreciation. Even the neighbors relaxed. The casseroles stopped. Conversations returned to weather and traffic. I let myself believe the addendum had done its work. Robert's sister called again, this time with a lighter voice. Well, she said, that was something. She suggested lunch. I agreed, grateful for normalcy. At the restaurant, she talked about her grandchildren, about a cruise she'd postponed. She didn't mention the clause. She didn't ask how I felt. When I brought up the children, she waved a hand. They're embarrassed, she said. It'll pass if. I wanted to believe that. Embarrassment feels temporary, manageable. A week later, I received an invitation to a private meeting with the executor. No lawyers, it said. Just a conversation. I prepared by rereading the trust documents, the way you study for a test you don't know how to pass. The judge's office was spare. Clean lines. No personal photos. She offered water and waited until I sat before she spoke. Your husband was meticulous, she said. Not affectionate. Observational. He anticipated conflict. I nodded. That much was clear. She explained the scope of her authority, what she could override, what she couldn't. She described the addendum as a containment strategy, a way to limit damage, not eliminate it. What kind of damage? I asked. She met my eyes. Relational, she said. Reputational, procedural. She told me the children had already requested modifications to certain distributions. Not to the amounts, those were locked, but to the timing and oversight. They framed it as efficiency. She framed it as influence. Your role, she said, was never about money. I waited. He wanted you positioned, she continued, as a stabilizing presence. Visible, legitimate, hard to erase. The word erase landed with a familiar weight. Leaving her office, I felt steadier, informed. I took that steadiness for peace. The children reached out separately over the next 2 weeks. Polite emails. Invitations to talk offline. The oldest daughter suggested coffee. The youngest sent a text asking if we could clear the air. I met the daughter first. Public place. Midday. She apologized without naming what she'd done. She said grief had made things complicated. She said the press conference had been misinterpreted. I listened. I didn't correct her. She asked if I'd known about the clause. I said no. That was true. Well, she said, exhaling, I guess Dad always had surprises. She smiled, and for a moment, I saw the version of her that had once asked me for advice about work, about relationships. I mistook that recognition for reconciliation. The youngest son's message stayed unanswered. Not intentionally, just delayed. I told myself I'd respond when things were calmer. At church, Robert's mother sat one row behind me instead of two. She touched my shoulder during the passing of peace. This has all been very hard, she said. Yes, I replied. I began to think about the future in practical terms. Downsizing, travel, continuing work that mattered to me without navigating family politics. I imagined a quiet independence, a life adjacent to theirs, but not entangled. Then the letters started arriving. Not official ones, not legal notices. Personal correspondence addressed to board members, donors, long-term partners. Copies forwarded to me by people who didn't know what to make of them. They were careful, not defamatory, just suggestive. Questions about my appropriate role, about respecting original family intentions, about whether I plan to maintain discretion. No single letter did much damage. Together, they formed a hum. I brought them to the executor. She frowned. This is within bounds, she said. Unfortunate, but permissible. So that's it? I asked. They can keep doing this? She considered. They can try. It took me longer than I like to admit to see what was happening. The addendum had stopped the spectacle. It hadn't stopped the strategy. Robert hadn't planned for harmony. He'd planned for endurance. That realization came not as a revelation, but as a dull understanding that settled into my bones. The false explanation that the will would resolve everything finally cracked. The consequences were just beginning, not loud, not public, quiet, administrative, relentless. And for the first time since his death, I felt something like anger, not sharp, but focused. I didn't act on it yet. I was still misreading what kind of fight this was. By the time I understood what the letters were really for, they'd already done their work. Nothing I touched collapsed outright. It just became heavier. Meetings that used to be routine took longer to schedule. Invitations arrived with fewer details. Conversations stopped one sentence short of clarity. People weren't rejecting me. They were hesitating around me, which was harder to push against without looking unreasonable. I kept showing up anyway. At the foundation, a board member I'd known for years pulled me aside after a meeting. Off the record, he said, lowering his voice, "There's concern about optics." "Whose optics?" I asked. He smiled, uncomfortable. "Everyone's." The answer told me more than he meant to. The children had learned something from the will reading. Not that they'd lost, but that they needed to change tactics. They stopped acting like heirs defending territory and started acting like stewards protecting process. It was subtle, effective. Another near discovery came from a hospital billing office. I was reviewing outstanding medical charges from Robert's last months, something I'd avoided until then. A clerk called to clarify insurance coverage. She mentioned a secondary policy I didn't recognize. "That was closed," she said, scrolling, "at the request of the family representative." "When?" I asked. She read the date. 2 days after Robert died. Before the press conference. Before anything had been said out loud. I thanked her and hung up, the pattern finally clicking into place. This wasn't about inheritance. It never had been. It was about authority. Who got to speak first? Who got believed? Who defined what family meant before anyone asked questions? Robert hadn't anticipated a single betrayal. He'd anticipated a campaign. I went back through old emails, this time with different eyes. The way his children had insisted on being copied on messages that didn't concern them. The way decisions were framed as emergencies that required immediate consensus. The way I'd been positioned as a participant, never a decider. I remembered a conversation from years ago, late at night, when I'd asked Robert why he'd restructured part of the foundation without telling me. He'd said, "I'm building redundancies. I laughed then, told him he sounded paranoid. Now I understood what he meant. The executor called me in again, this time with a folder thicker than before. She laid out timelines, overlaps, correspondence. She didn't accuse. She didn't dramatize. This is coordinated, she said simply. So what happens now? I asked. She closed the folder. Now, she said, the clause finishes unfolding. She explained that the addendum had a second phase, one Robert had never mentioned to me, one that relied not on public humiliation, but on persistence. If the children continued efforts to marginalize the spouse through indirect means, administrative pressure, reputational erosion, procedural delays, authority would shift again, more permanently, not assets oversight. They would lose control of narrative platforms they valued, the foundation's public voice, certain advisory roles, access to donor communications. But only if the pattern is documented, she said, and only if you don't intervene. Intervene how? By smoothing things over, she replied, by accepting quiet concessions in exchange for silence. I thought of the coffee apology, the church touch on my shoulder, the invitations to clear the air. They weren't peace offerings. They were containment attempts. The executor asked if I wanted to proceed. I didn't answer right away. That night, I drove past the courthouse where the press conference had happened. The steps were empty, ordinary, the rope long gone. I remembered how small I'd felt standing there, unsure if I was allowed to exist in my own grief. I realized then that Robert hadn't left me a weapon. He'd left me a position. All I had to do was stay in it. So I stopped explaining myself. I stopped accepting private apologies. I attended every meeting I was entitled to and declined the ones framed as favors. I let emails sit until they required formal responses. The letters increased. The hesitations sharpened. The documentation grew. People noticed. Quietly. The children noticed too. The youngest son finally called again. This time his voice wasn't careful. It was tight. You don't have to do this, he said. Do what? I asked. Make it worse. I looked at the stack of forwarded letters on my desk. The delayed reimbursements. The closed policy. I didn't start this, I said. I just stopped absorbing it. There was silence on the line. Then he hung up. A week later, the executor sent notice of a formal review. Public procedural unavoidable. The pattern was complete. Only then did I understand the full shape of what Robert had built. Not a shield for me, but a mirror. One that reflected behavior back to its source until no one could pretend it was accidental. The power shift wasn't dramatic. It was administrative. And it was already happening. The review didn't feel like a climax. It felt like paperwork catching up with people. By the time the notices went out, no one was surprised. That, more than anything, told me how long this had been building. The language was neutral, oversight reassessment, governance realignment, conflict mitigation, but the effect was immediate. Meetings were postponed. Advisory votes were suspended. Public statements required approval from the executor's office. For the first time since Robert died, the children stopped speaking publicly. Privately, they spoke plenty. The oldest daughter sent an email that read like a resume of grievances, years of perceived slights, of feeling displaced, of watching their father change. She didn't accuse me outright, but my presence sat in every sentence like an unspoken cause. I read it twice and didn't respond. The youngest son showed up at my house one afternoon without calling. He stood on the porch the way his aunt had, coat still on, ready to leave. This isn't what Dad wanted, he said. I didn't invite him in. I didn't ask him to leave. What did he want? I asked. He hesitated. For us to be a family. I thought about the press conference, the letters, the closed insurance policy, the quiet pressure applied before anyone raised a voice. He wanted us to behave like one, I said. There's a difference. He flinched, just slightly. That was the first time I saw something crack. Inside, the house felt too quiet. Robert's absence had settled into permanence. I no longer expected him to walk through the door. The grief had changed shape, less sharp, more structural. At the foundation, the board voted to place public communications under temporary independent management. It was framed as a cooling off period. No names were mentioned. Everyone understood who it applied to. A donor called me directly, an older woman I'd known for years. "I just wanted you to know," she said. "This didn't come from nowhere." Authority figures again. Quiet ones. The kind who see patterns early and wait. The review uncovered nothing illegal, nothing scandalous. That was the point. The behavior had stayed just inside the lines. Respectable. Deniable. But when it was all laid out, timelines, correspondence, coordinated requests, the intent became undeniable. The executor shared the findings with me before they went public. She didn't soften them. "Your husband anticipated erosion," she said, "not attack." The final shift came in the form of a letter. Hand delivered. Thick envelope. The children's attorney informing them that their advisory roles were being dissolved pending further notice. That certain platforms would now operate independently. That future participation would require consensus, not inheritance. They still had their money. That never changed. What they lost was control. After that, the call stopped. Church became easier. Not warm, but neutral. Robert's mother moved back to her original pew. She didn't look at me. I didn't take it personally anymore. One afternoon, I found the envelope again, the one with my name in Robert's handwriting. This time, I read it all the way through. At the end, in a section that hadn't been referenced publicly, there was a paragraph he'd written himself. Not legal language, just his voice, flattened by formality. He wrote that he loved his children, that he trusted my judgment, that he knew conflict would come and wanted it contained, not resolved, that he believed power revealed character more reliably than grief ever could. I sat with that longer than anything else. People asked later if it felt like justice. It didn't. It felt like recognition arriving late and without apology. The family never reconciled. That surprised outsiders more than it surprised me. Some things, once named, can't be smoothed back into silence. I stayed in the house another year, long enough to decide it wasn't about proving anything. Then I moved somewhere smaller, quieter. I kept my work. I kept my name. Sometimes, when I think about the press conference, I remember how certain they looked, how finished the story seemed to them. They weren't wrong about everything. They just didn't know how much of it had already been written. After the review concluded, people expected something from me. Not a speech, not a lawsuit, just a visible reaction. Closure, maybe. A posture that told them how to feel about what had happened. When none came, they filled the silence with their own conclusions. I learned quickly that restraint confuses people more than anger ever does. The foundation stabilized under its new structure. Fewer events, less spectacle. The kind of work Robert had claimed to want, but rarely slowed down enough to enforce. I stayed involved, but differently. I no longer smoothed conversations or anticipated objections. I did what I was authorized to do and nothing more. That boundary changed how people treated me. At work, a colleague asked if I was relieved. I said I was adjusting. She nodded like she understood, though I could tell she didn't. Relief implies an ending. This felt more like a long exhale that hadn't yet reached the bottom of my lungs. The children didn't disappear. They receded. Occasionally, their names surfaced in minutes or correspondence, stripped of familiarity. Roles once assumed were now conditional. Attendance required invitations. Influence required patience. I saw Robert's daughter once at a grocery store. We passed each other in the produce aisle, both reaching for oranges. She froze, then straightened. "This didn't have to be like this," she said. I thought about the clause, the letters, the early policy cancellation, the press conference framed as necessity. "No," I said. "It didn't." She waited, maybe for me to add something. I didn't. She nodded and walked away. That interaction stayed with me longer than the whole reading. It was the first time I understood that they didn't see themselves as aggressors. They saw themselves as correcting an imbalance they believed already existed. I had been an anomaly in their family structure, present, legal, but never fully legitimate. Howard doesn't like anomalies. At church, the women who'd once hugged me tightly now asked about my plans. Travel. Work. As if the chapter had closed neatly. I answered politely. I didn't correct their framing. Grief, I learned, doesn't resolve when conflicts do. It just loses its audience. One evening, I sat with the executor for a final review. She explained what would remain in place and what would revert. She asked if I had any concerns. Just one, I said. Did he ever think this would fix things? She shook her head. He thought it would prevent damage, she said. That's not the same thing. Driving home, I realized how much energy I'd spent trying to be understandable, to be reasonable, to be the version of myself others could accept without resistance. I stopped doing that slowly, without ceremony. The house sold in late spring. The day I handed over the keys, I walked through the rooms one last time. No flashbacks, no speeches, just an inventory of what no longer needed to come with me. In the kitchen, I remember the Thanksgiving table being rearranged, the silence that followed, the moment I'd chosen peace over correction. I didn't regret it. It had bought me years of relative calm. But peace that relies on erasure always sends the bill later. I moved into a smaller place across town. Fewer rooms. More light. No history in the walls. The neighbors didn't know my name or my story. That anonymity felt earned. Occasionally, reporters still reached out. Anniversary angles. How does it feel now? I never answered. Not because I was hiding, but because the question assumed a feeling I didn't have. What I felt was alignment. My life finally matched the truth of what had happened. Not the public version, not the family version, but the procedural one. The one written slowly, in margins and clauses and quiet refusals. One afternoon, months later, I received a forwarded email by mistake. A reply all that included me when it shouldn't have. A board member asking another, "Do we need to loop her in?" The response came quickly. Yes, it read. She is standing. I stared at that phrase longer than I expected. Standing. Not sympathy. Not favor. Recognition. That was the aftermath no one had prepared me for. The first anniversary of Robert's death passed without ceremony. No articles. No flowers. No calls from people who used to mark the date with reminders. I noticed it only because the light outside looked the way it had that morning, thin, undecided, like winter wasn't ready to let go. I spent the day at work. Regular meetings. Familiar tasks. At lunch, I walked to a small park nearby and sat on a bench with a sandwich I'd packed myself. No one recognized me. That felt right. Later that week, a thick envelope arrived from the executor's office. Final documents. Confirmation of settled oversight. A letter thanking me for my cooperation. Professional. Clean. At the bottom, a handwritten note. He trusted you because you stayed where others maneuvered. I folded it once and put it away. I still hear Robert's voice sometimes, not in the way people mean when they talk about ghosts, but in remembered phrases. His habit of ending arguments by saying, "Let's document it." His belief that time revealed more than confrontation ever could. He was right about that. The children never apologized. Not formally. Not privately. They adjusted, which, in their world, counted as acknowledgement. I adjusted too. I stopped attending certain events. Not out of bitterness, but because they no longer served me. I kept relationships that felt reciprocal. I let the rest fade without explanation. Every now and then, someone would ask what it was like to win. I never knew how to answer that. Nothing was taken from anyone that hadn't already been given to them. Nothing was returned to me that I hadn't already been entitled to. The law didn't reward virtue or punish cruelty. It simply recorded behavior and responded accordingly. That's not triumph. That's accounting. One afternoon, years later, I ran into the youngest son at a community fundraiser. He looked older, quieter. We spoke politely. He asked how I was. I'm steady, I said. He nodded, as if that meant something to him now. Before we parted, he said, he thought you'd hold. I didn't ask what he meant. I understood. Walking home, I thought about the press conference again, not the words, but the timing. How quickly they'd stepped into certainty. How early they'd celebrated. They hadn't been wrong about power shifting. They just misjudged the direction. Robert didn't leave me a fortune to wield or a family to conquer. He left me a position that required patience, endurance, and restraint. The same things I'd been practicing long before anyone noticed. In the end, what changed wasn't my status or my standing. It was who had to account for their actions and who no longer did. That was the quietest inheritance of all.